If you put all that together, the impatience of Trump, the need to get his bloody Nobel Peace Prize, the genuine desire to stop the killing, the transactional nature of diplomacy, the weakness of Ukraine after almost 4 years of war, and Russia not really giving an inch on its red lines, all that, I have to say, doesn't spell anything positive for the future of Ukraine, but also possibly Europe. Hello and welcome to TrumpWorld. I'm Matt Frei in London, and happy Thanksgiving. Now, Anushka isn't with us this week. She is celebrating Thanksgiving. She's getting ready for the big turkey meal at home. So I'm very happy to say that sitting in her place, we have Lindsay Hilsum, our international editor. Lindsay, welcome to TrumpWorld.
Thank you very much. It's a joy to be here.
And a joy to have you. And so much to discuss, especially when it comes to America, Europe, and Ukraine. Now, strange things have been going on in the last week. We had, the leaked 28-point plan that was loved by the Russians, but rejected by the Ukrainians and by the Europeans. Now we've got, I think, is it a 19 or 20-point plan, which is a slightly different version. We'll go into the mechanics of all that. But every day stuff is coming out. And we'll try and, give you the bigger picture when we talk to Fiona Hill later in the program. She, of course, was one of the most senior advisors on Ukraine, Europe, and Russia in 3 successive administrations, Bush, Obama, and Trump 1. So you'll hear that conversation later on. But let's first of all unpack the latest developments, which was this extraordinary leak on Bloomberg about a conversation between Steve Witkoff, Trump's envoy to everywhere and everything, and Yuri Ushakov, who is Putin's kind of senior foreign policy advisor. Lindsay, tell us about this leak. What does it say?
Well, what's extraordinary is first there's a very sort of chummy chit-chat sort of feeling about it. And then what Witkoff does is he advises Ushakov on how to deal with Trump, that basically he and his boss, Mr. Putin, should show their respect to President Trump as a man of peace. And so basically he's telling him how to butter up and flatter Trump. And then there's the other extraordinary bit in it. He says, well, I know that Donetsk and the land swap is going to be in there somewhere. Well, hang on. This is not a real estate deal, Steve. This is something different. And the idea that he should be advising the Russians or saying to them, yeah, it's going to be this thing where the Ukrainians have to give away Donetsk. No, hang on. That is not what the Ukrainians are going to have to do. That is an issue to be negotiated. And the other thing is that he suggested that Trump and Putin should have a call before Trump met Zelensky. And we all know that when Trump talks to Putin before meeting Zelensky, what he comes out with, he's very, open to what Putin says, and he just sort of comes out with all the Russian talking points. And so I think you have to put all this in the context of when Steve Witkoff, do you remember when Steve Witkoff first met Putin? He didn't actually bother to have the State Department translator. He used the Kremlin translator as if that, wasn't an issue. And whatever Steve Witkoff is, he is not a Kremlinologist. He doesn't seem to understand that the Russians will have very detailed personality profiles on everybody involved. He doesn't seem to have talked to other people who've negotiated with the Russians. Well, I have. And I know, and how incredibly detailed the Russians are. And you can't just sort of throw out these ideas. The other thing which it made me think of is how, in the past, Steve Witkoff has sort of talked about Putin and suggested that there was real warmth between him and President Trump. Warmth from President Putin. I mean, Putin is about as warm as a frozen turkey before Thanksgiving, isn't he?
The impression that I've had from the very beginning, there have been several constants in this sort of journey that we've all been on when it comes to what is called still vaguely a peace process over Ukraine. Number one, Trump is impatient. He was the guy who declared even before he was elected, he was going to solve it all in 24 hours. Well, obviously, that didn't quite work out that way, but he's still very impatient, and he showed the impatience last week. Number two, they don't really care that much about Ukraine's sovereignty and its self-determination. That's something that was borne out in the campaign by people like J.D. Vance. That's something that, you get the drift of that in the conversations, including the one that we just talked about, between American delegates and their Russian counterparts. Number three, they don't really care that much about European security either. And, the Europeans always, the process is this. The Americans talk to the Russians. The Russians give them a list of things that they really want. The Americans sign off on it. They present this to the Europeans and the Ukrainians. They say, you've got to be kidding. The thing is then amended. They go back to the Russians who say, niet. And I kind of think that's where we are at the moment. But before we discuss how that works and what it is about this sort of diplomacy of envoys as opposed to diplomats that is proving troublesome, let's just listen to what Trump had to say. And it really gives you a sense of the impatience of the man.
We're having good talks. We started with Russia. We're having some talks with Russia. Ukraine is doing well. I think they're pretty happy about it. They'd like to see it end. And we won't know for a little while, but we're making progress.
What are the next
We settled 8 wars, and I thought this would be one of the easier ones because of my relationship with President Putin. But this is probably one of the more difficult ones. There's a lot of hatred.
Okay, well, there is a lot of hatred, and after almost 4 years of war, there's also a lot of death, as Donald Trump would put it. I mean, the casualty numbers are monstrous, and in the charnel house of eastern Ukraine, they are mounting every week. And I think we have to give Trump some credit for genuinely, I think, authentically wanting to stop all the killing. But the question, Lindsay, of course, is at what cost?
Pretty much every day, I message a friend who lives in Kramatorsk in Donetsk. And the reason I message him is to check he's still alive. And he doesn't usually come back to me on the same day because there's no power. There's no internet. It's freezing cold. It's pretty hellish. People in Donetsk and the rest of Ukraine are desperate for this to stop, but not at any cost. And in this first 28-point plan, the idea was that Kramatorsk, which has been defended very bravely, would just be handed over, as would Slavyansk and other towns in Donetsk, which Ukrainian soldiers have defended fiercely from the beginning, and many of them have lost their lives doing so. So the cost politically within Ukraine of just giving up that territory, which the Russians haven't won, is immense. And I think that when we come back to Steve Witkoff saying, oh, well, they're just going to have to give up Donetsk, doesn't understand that whereas there is an understanding, certainly amongst the political class in Ukraine, that the lines might have to be frozen and that there will be a de facto understanding that Ukraine is not going to get back the territory that they have lost initially. That is completely different from giving away territory that the Russians have not won on the battlefield. So I think that is really significant. The other thing is it's the back to front nature of diplomacy. So yes, you can argue that the State Department or British diplomats or European diplomats in general have failed in many cases in the past. However, there is a way of doing diplomacy which is understood, which is that you generally start with some talks which lead to a ceasefire. And then once you've got a ceasefire, then you can have some more talks. And then eventually you get to the point where you have a document, and that document may be tweaked or negotiated. But the Sherpas, the people who are the diplomats who know about these things, are the ones who started. And the way the Trump administration does is completely the other way around. They start with a random document, which seems to be all Russian talking points, and then we go backwards into negotiations, and we're still nowhere near a ceasefire because all the time the Russians are pummeling Ukraine and putting the lights out.
I'd love to know who actually leaked the 28-point plan, because this leak came at a time when arguably Zelensky was at his weakest point ever, and that is engulfed in the middle of a very tawdry corruption scandal, which involves $100 million or so of money that should have been gone towards building shelters and securing nuclear substations. This has gone into the pockets of some people who are quite close to Zelensky, not Zelensky himself, but people in his circle. And the Ukrainian population was outraged by this scandal, which was, by the way, not just read out by the anti-corruption agency in the form of an indictment or a press conference. It was leaked in a kind of Netflix style series that popped up on people's phones that was very slickly produced. And so this was a real problem for Zelensky. I mean, it is still a problem for Zelensky, but into the middle of this scandal pops a leak of this plan, which then allows Zelensky to once again, in the style of February 2022, turn up in front of, I think St. Sophia Cathedral in Kyiv, and then give an incredibly powerful speech. We, the Ukrainian people, have arrived at a very critical juncture. We either choose our dignity or we, and lose our partner, America, or we keep the Americans on side, but we suffer capitulation, more or less. And the nation momentarily was distracted from the corruption scandal and rallied behind him.
Yeah. So you have to think, so whose advantage was the leak? Well, it wasn't to the advantage of the Russians, and it wasn't to the advantage of the American administration. It was to the advantage of Republicans and others within Congress who actually support Ukraine and think that what the White House is doing is a travesty. And it was to the advantage of those poor benighted diplomats in the State Department who are being totally sidelined by this personal diplomacy, which is what Trump favors with his son-in-law and his old real estate mate Steve Witkoff. So what there within America or within the American system, there are many who would have been very, very unhappy about this. Now, on the Ukrainian corruption scandal, yes, absolutely. This was blow after blow. I was in Ukraine in July when the government did this weird thing of trying to close down NABU. NABU is the corruption investigation department, which is independent of the administration. And people came out on the streets, and it was extraordinary to be there with people coming out on the streets, because what people were saying was, we are fighting our sons and brothers, and it mainly was brothers because these were young people on the streets. We are fighting to be a democracy. We are not fighting to have this kind of corruption, which they have in Russia. We're fighting against that kind of system.
And Zelensky was elected on that ticket, wasn't he? On an anti-corruption ticket.
Absolutely, he was. And they said, we totally support Zelensky and we totally support the war. And this is a horror. And he had to reverse it. But what has come out was that one of the reasons that there were people who wanted to close it down, which he acquiesced to. They wanted to close it down because they knew that there was a corruption scandal coming that was getting close to him. And by close to him, I don't mean to him. I mean to people who he knows well and are his friends. So, yes, this has weakened him tremendously. The corruption scandal, at least 100 million, if not more, is about money which was siphoned off that should have been spent on the power grid and nuclear power. And, nothing is closer to Ukrainians' hearts at the moment than power, because they are without electricity so much of the time.
I mean, I cannot imagine the anger that people all over Ukraine feel that this money's been siphoned off. And I think it's worth pointing out just quickly, Lindsay, that within the diplomatic camps on both the American side and the Russian side, it's not all sweetness and light. I mean, there is a fissure there between Rubio, who's a slightly more traditional diplomat, than J.D. Vance and his henchman, one of whom was in Kyiv the other day.
Dan Driscoll, who is the U.S. Army Secretary, suddenly seems to have got involved.
Yeah, where did he come from?
Yeah, exactly. Well, where he came from was being close to J.D. Vance. And in the administration, the person who dislikes Ukraine the most, I think, is the Vice President, J.D. Vance. And if you go back to the Munich Security Conference the year before this administration got into office and listen to J.D. Vance on a panel, and at that point he's not even the running mate or anything, he's just a senator, talking about Ukraine, and he is very clear. He says, the Europeans are completely deluded. There is no way Ukraine can win. America has no interest in this fight. We have no dog in it. And you should and if you add up all the numbers of what it would take, the number of missiles, the number, all of the munitions it would take to win, it's a complete waste of time. You should give up now and let it go. So J.D. Vance has an almost personal crusade against Ukraine and against this war, and he really doesn't care if Russia wins or not. He just doesn't get it. And of course, that goes along with J.D. Vance's hostility to Europe, which was borne out in the Munich Security Conference after they did get to office. So Driscoll is his man. And so what we're seeing at the moment from the American side is this Witkoff, this envoy who seems to be very naive and very pro-Russia, then J.D. Vance's man, and then poor old Marco Rubio trying to do a bit more of traditional diplomacy coming in at the last minute. Well, think what this looks like from Moscow and from Kyiv. From Moscow, it looks like a bonanza because they are so brilliant at negotiating and they know how to manipulate everybody and everything. And this lot are just easy to play with.
Although having said that, Lindsay, we should just interject quickly that there are a few wrinkles on the Russian side as well, although not as serious. You've got Sergei Lavrov, the veteran growly diplomat, who's been there for decades, the foreign minister, who thinks he's in charge of these negotiations. And then you've got Kirill Dmitriev, who's the head of the Russian Sovereign Wealth Fund, who was educated at Stanford, at Harvard Business School, went to high school in California for a couple of years as well. Very, very smart guy. But he was the bloke who was flown to Miami in October, for long negotiations with Witkoff, where they came up with this 28-point plan that everyone calls a capitulation document. But Lavrov hates Dmitriev because he thinks that rather like, Rubio and Witkoff, he thinks that Dmitriev is stealing his diplomatic thunder. So there was a wonderful scene at one of the summits where they discussed Ukraine. I think it was a meeting in Saudi Arabia. And Lavrov had Dmitriev's chair literally removed from the table. And Dmitriev arrives, there's no chair for me. Where's the placement? I'm not sitting anywhere. He's very upset. So he calls his wife, who's a very close friend of Putin's daughter, because they run a foundation together. Putin's daughter calls Putin. Putin then rings up Lavrov and says, put the bloody chair back. And Dmitriev is sitting back at the table. But the point about him is that because he's a business guy, rather like Witkoff, for those two, they're in a different galaxy here. It's about deals, making deals. And one of the things that really upset the German chancellor last week, Friedrich Merz, who's one of the proponents of using Russia's frozen assets, $350 billion, whatever it is, to basically rebuild Ukraine after the destruction caused by the people who used to own that money, was that, in one of the points of the plan, 100 billion of those frozen assets would be kind of invested in Ukraine, but 50% of the profits would go to the Americans without them putting out any money. I mean, it's basically, as someone called it, a Chatham House, which is a very sober kind of think tank here in London, as you know, Lindsay, because you spend a lot of time there. Their conclusion was mafia-style extortion. And I think that's something that, many Europeans would agree with. So there's the sort of financial aspect, the trading aspect to this whole deal that is always there in the background that drives a lot of what Trump and his administration are trying to do. And if you put all that together, the impatience of Trump, the need to get his bloody Nobel Peace Prize, genuine desire to stop the killing, the transactional nature of diplomacy, the weakness of Ukraine after almost 4 years of war, and Russia not really giving an inch on its red lines, all that, I have to say, doesn't spell anything positive for the future of Ukraine, but also possibly Europe.
Well, let's come back to that. Let's come back to what it's actually like in Ukraine. So we've talked about the internal politics of all of these three countries. But on the original document, which I understand now has been changed, America giving away things which are not its to give away. Ukrainian territory does not belong to the US. And so although Ukrainian people understand there's going to have to be compromise, to be given away in this way as if they have no agency of their own is completely unacceptable. But yes, it is very hard it will be very hard for Ukrainians to live through another winter with what they are enduring now. And of course, the other aspect of it is the possibility of America cutting off intelligence and weapon supplies. Now, at the moment, the Europeans are buying American weapons to supply Ukraine. To some extent, that has become less of an issue because Ukraine makes so many of its own weapons, particularly advanced drones and unmanned ground vehicles, which, I've reported on several times now. But American intelligence is still absolutely critical. And one of the most difficult things at the moment is the missiles and drones that come in from America and are taking out civilian infrastructure across the cities. And the Patriot missiles, which the Americans originally supplied, the ammunition is running short, but so every time they fire, it counts, and it costs a lot of money. And they need the American intelligence to know where the Russian missiles are coming in. And without that intelligence, then they're firing blind. So that is where the Ukrainians are extremely vulnerable and extremely weak. And so that is why the Ukrainians are going to have to compromise, and they're going to have to deal with this very this administration that goes by whim and not by knowledge.
Well, Lindsay, thank you so much for your insights. It's always great to talk to you, whether it's the Middle East or Russia and Ukraine and the United States, of course. Really fascinating stuff, and I hope we can do it again. So, Lindsay, happy Thanksgiving to you, and thank you very much for coming on TrumpWorld. Well, I'm very happy to say that we're going to bring in Fiona Hill. She's very rare as not just a Russia expert, but also someone who worked for 3 administrations, Bush, Obama, and Trump 1. So she knows how the White House works, she knows how American foreign policy can work, and she knows an awful lot about Russia and, of course, currently the situation between Russia and Ukraine and Europe's response to all this. Fiona, welcome to the program.
Oh, thanks, Matt. Great to be with you.
There's a lot of stuff going on. There are lots of moving parts. But if you look at today and you look at where we are and you compare that to the rest of the year, do you see a pattern here? A kind of farrago, a dance where the Americans talk to the Russians, or rather Steve Witkoff talks to his friend Kirill Dmitriev. They agree something. The Ukrainians and the Europeans throw their hands up in despair. It goes back to the drawing board. And then the Russians say no.
Yes. I mean, I think at this point, that pattern, that choreography is very apparent. And, it works very much in Vladimir Putin's favor because, he feels that this is a win-win-win situation in the terms of, incremental success on the battlefield, on the front lines in Ukraine, all this success in the propaganda and information war, the other battlefields with, Europe and the world at large. He's constantly, setting the tone and the tempo for this dance, for this choreography. And then, the other win is that, he really feels that he's got Trump where he wants him. I mean, every time Vladimir Putin, calls a dance move, Trump, gets out there. I mean, I like that, analogy and that, metaphor you've been using there, and comes and dances along with him. And Putin, can kind of maneuver him around the dance floor. Now, he doesn't always, get to take center stage here, because again, there's also other people rushing in here, kind of a sort of European mosh pit, changing the whole, more stately choreography here. But Putin definitely feels, that for him, he is on the front foot where everybody else is on the back foot. Maybe we've taken that metaphor as far as we can, by the way.
Well, I think we've exhausted it.
Anyway.
But we'll try and find another one that fits. But I mean, we were all shocked, weren't we, at the beginning of the second Trump administration with that very long phone call between Trump and Putin, and the suspicion was that Trump was very much on Putin's side. Then we had that disastrous meeting in the Oval Office with Zelensky, where Zelensky was mauled by Vance and by Trump. And then after that, things seem to move further in Ukraine's direction. I just wonder whether actually, honestly, nothing has really changed in the last 10 months, whether Trump is still where he was at the beginning of his second term, more on Putin's side than Ukraine's side.
Well, of course, lots of things have changed on the battlefield in horrific fashion. And both Ukraine and Russia are hurting. I mean, Ukraine, obviously, in visible ways that we can all see, just the grinding horror of this war that we would all like to see end. And for Putin, things have become uncomfortable. I mean, people have forgotten now that he had actually an insurrection against him at one point, during the war by Yevgeny Prigozhin.
The late Yevgeny Prigozhin.
Yeah. The very late Yevgeny Prigozhin, because of the mass slaughter of people that he'd recruited to the front. And that has continued unabated. And every incremental gain that the Russians have made have been at massive cost. But as far as the other part of your question is concerned, with Trump, nothing really has changed. He has been on Russia's side insofar as he thinks that Russia is a great power, Putin is a great man. He's a strong man. He's somebody that Trump wants the approval of, just like he wants the same for President Xi. He doesn't want there just to be a kind of a dual bromance there with Xi and Putin in all of the other world fora. He wants that part of the action, for himself. And Zelensky and Ukraine are an encumbrance. Zelensky is a lesser being. He's not a wartime president in Trump's view. He's an irritant, and he wants to get rid of him just as much as Putin does. Trump wants to get on with the main action, which is him, basically dealing with the big guys on the world stage, which for him, rather strangely is still Russia, but also, more evidently, also China, most evidently China. I mean, I think for Trump, his idea of what is strong, what is powerful, and where he should be putting all of his attention is, slightly off kilter when we do a full assessment of where things are in the world. I mean, other major players, be it the Brazilians, the South Africans, the Indians, Indonesians, many others, would actually say that Russia is a spent force. It hasn't been able to get what it wants in the time that it set for itself on the battlefield in Ukraine. It's getting its ass kicked, irrespective of how this, comes out. And all the time we see power shifting, not just to the east in terms of East Asia and China, but to the Middle East, and to the fact that all of these issues of war and peace are now being resolved by players like Qatar or UAE. Everything is happening in Dubai or Doha or, Saudi Arabia. And the Saudi, Crown Prince MBS, being the person who's holding court and holding influence here. So, the United States has ceded so much also of its own power and influence and respect because Trump has made what I think is a, pretty fatal miscalculation on where power lies in the international system.
That's really interesting. I mean, I was in Alaska for that weird summit, and, Trump only spoke for 3 minutes and 25 seconds. And even his staunchest supporters thought that he wasn't at the top of his talking game or weaving game or any game. And he must have known after that Putin was playing him. So I wonder what you think Trump thinks is in it for him by being nice to Vladimir Putin.
Well, look, he thinks, again, that Putin is his counterpart. He can't admit to himself that he's being played. And you notice that whenever that's pointed out, he gets very angry and he basically berates anybody who asks him that question, particularly people who he thinks is lesser mortals. And that's journalists, particularly women journalists. We've seen the way that he behaves when he's asked uncomfortable questions in other settings, be it on Air Force One, recently in the White House. It's other world leaders who, he expects to kiss up to him at all the time and to flatter him and to thank him for, frankly, doing something that doesn't bear thanks at all. I mean, he's actually making life much more difficult, more uncomfortable for everyone else. So no, there's no way that he could possibly admit to himself that he's being played by Putin. He wants more than anything else the adulation, the respect and the attention of Vladimir Putin. I mean, look, he's rushing to go to Beijing and to host Xi. He wants the spectacle of being able to do that and being wined and dined, probably in all of that gilded splendor of the Kremlin, and being able to bring, Putin to show him, his kind of equivalent now in the White House. He's playing on a totally different front. He's playing a game of backroom politics, deals and splendor and big state dinners and ballrooms. And he's not playing on the grubby, dirty battlefield that everybody else is being, forced to engage on.
I mean, I think it was Steve Witkoff when he met Vladimir Putin at one of his earlier meetings. He said that the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg really reminded him of Mar-a-Lago, which I thought was rather indicative.
Yes, which came first.
Yeah, which came
first. We all
first.
know that Mary Meriwether Post had an obsession with Russian culture. So maybe, there's no coincidence there. Mary Meriwether Post had a huge collection of Russian art and, built up Hillwood Museum, which is based on, basically what she saw there. So, but Steve Witkoff wasn't wrong. It's just that he didn't understand the context.
So when you worked for Trump, did the things that you have just described, the things that motivate him, was that obvious? And give me some examples of that being obvious.
It became obvious over time. I think, we all can see now how constrained Trump felt. obviously fettered, chained, in that first administration. He was chafing, at the bit of being controlled by H.R. McMaster, John Bolton, Rex Tillerson, John Kelly, you name all the people who have been long forgotten in many respects, from that first
Who he hates and who hate him.
He hates, yes, because they stopped him from doing what he wants to do. And now he has everyone who is enabling all of his inner instincts. This is for him, all of this is a transaction and a deal. And I think it's extraordinarily evident now when we look back at the past that, you look at that original 28-point plan, although I don't know how original it was and exactly who drew it up, but it was all geared towards making Trump look good as well, not just of Russian interests. The peace board that Trump is supposed to preside over. Why pick that title unless you've got the Nobel Peace Prize in mind? The idea of Trump mediating somehow between NATO and Russia that was in that initial
Weird. Yeah.
Which suggests that the US is no longer part of NATO, which in Trump's mind he's been trying to get out of from the first round as well. And when we're seeing this come into fruition, now. And again, all of these ideas that the frozen assets, instead of going towards Ukrainian reconstruction, should be put into some kind of fund that the US and Russia would jointly preside over. That's very similar to the minerals deal and everything else that's been put on the table. And all I'm just sort of saying is you can see in contrast with where we are now to where it was at the beginning, that all of those attempts to do similar sorts of things early on were very much constrained, or that they were, basically counteracted by people around him in the first administration. So we see all the things that he would have liked to have done the first time around. And in fact, when we look back to the infamous phone call that sparked off the first impeachment, that parallel process that people pointed out of envoys and emissaries and others doing backdoor deals is now the main process. It's not in the shadows, it's out in front.
So Trump, has been given credit by a lot of people, and I think even by you, for getting the ball rolling. But of course, the ball has rolled mostly in Russia's direction. Then it rolls back again a little bit in Ukraine and Europe's direction. Do you think that the Ukrainians, and indeed the Europeans by extension, would have been better off if Trump hadn't done anything at all?
Well, look, these are the kinds of counterfactual kind of questions that we'll probably have a bit more attempt at being able to answer years from now, when we get actually more of a sense of exactly what's happened. Right now we're all in the fog of war. It is very important to find a way of ending this war. So, and I think that Trump is probably one of the main people on the world stage now who genuinely wants to end the slaughter. Putin doesn't. The Ukrainians obviously do, but, as they said, not at the expense of their survival and as a country and their dignity and respect and all the rest of it. But the problem is that Trump is always driving this for his own priorities and his own timeline. He's not got the interests of the Ukrainians uppermost, apart from, obviously, the death on the battlefield. And he's certainly not thinking about the long-term implications for European or, larger global security, and about what it might mean if Putin is able to show that war wins, that you can be successful no matter how high the cost at pursuing a war to what you want to be its logical conclusion. That's a terrible message, to send at a time when there are so many wars raging, half the time that we're not even paying attention to, in Africa, and, we're seeing all the, slaughter there, places like Sudan and elsewhere. And when you're thinking about what the implications of this might be for other places, and if you're a US ally at this point, if you're South Korea, if you're Japan, if you're Taiwan, that is in that, strange, ambiguous, position, and you're looking at what the US is doing here, you've got to think, well, the US is never going to have my interests at heart. It's always, or under Trump, going to bow towards the interests of the bigger power. And in Trump's view, there are only two other big powers in the world, and that's China and Russia, which again is somewhat odd because Russia isn't in that position anymore. It's not the Soviet Union, but Trump still thinks of it like that.
So he doesn't really have any understanding or empathy for the idea of a sovereign, independent, viable Ukrainian nation state. Is that the fundamental problem here? And that if anyone, who disagrees with them on that front, like the Europeans, for instance, who also have geographical skin in the game, he brushes them aside for being a bunch of freeloaders.
I think that's correct because, look, and part of this is Europeans' fault as well. Since World War I and the initial, bailing out, as the Americans would put it, or Trump would put it anyway, of Europe after the first war of German invasions, and very much so even more after the Second World War, where the United States took full responsibility for the security and reconstruction of Europe. The viewpoint is that Europe hasn't really, had any skin in the game, even if it might have political and geographical skin, but in terms of stepping up on its own security and, really creating proper independence of being able to defend themselves. So Trump is of the same view that Vladimir Putin is about Europe and anywhere else. You only have sovereignty if you are capable of defending it for yourself. And the irony, of course, is that Ukraine has been prepared to defend its own sovereignty. Admittedly, it's needed, a lot of armaments from other countries, but the Ukrainians have been tenacious in this, in ways that ought to be recognized. They're just as fierce and just as dedicated to the battle as the Russians are. There's just a complete and utter disproportion in terms of the power, the manpower, etc. But Trump always moves in the direction of who has, in his view, the preponderance of power. And power for him is always defined as military power and then also economic and financial power. And he looks at Ukraine and says, well, you don't have that.
Right. And I remember actually Zelensky, when I interviewed him, told me nobody likes a loser. And he suddenly spoke in English when he said that line, and that was before Trump was elected. It was almost, a premonition of what was to come. But I just wonder on Europe, Fiona, I mean, doesn't Trump have a point on Europe? Not only have they been kind of, piggybacking in terms of security of the Americans for a long time, but also even now with Trump breathing down their neck, with Putin on their doorstep, they're incapable of speaking with one voice. They can't even get their arms industry to be more coordinated. They don't have a single line when it comes to the frozen Russian assets. I mean, this is pretty disastrous, isn't it?
Well, it could be. I still think there's a chance, but I think you can't get to the kind of situation that we're looking for here, which is, again, of Europeans in some formulation getting their act together if you start from the top. And basically what you need to do is get a coalition, not just of the willing, but of the capable. And I think we can look at our Scandinavian counterparts, the Baltic states, Poland. There are a group of countries. Look, Italy as well, has a very important arms industry. And we've seen, some different positions from Giorgia Meloni. I mean, she is actually seeing here that, maybe things are not as simple as she herself and her populist guys would have put things, that there are a lot of risks to the sovereignty of European countries coming from this. So I think what you have to do is you have to get a group of countries that are actually capable of taking action together in support of Ukraine, but in support of themselves, in support of Europe. I think there's the Joint Expeditionary Force. I've mentioned this, before in discussions, which, the UK leads along with the Scandinavian counterparts. There is a lot of capability on a smaller scale within Europe that needs to be tapped into. But I think, the big problem is now people are in the thrall of both Trump and Putin. The propaganda war against Europe is coming from two fronts right now, from and China isn't really doing this, and North Korea and Iran to the extent, frankly, that Russia and the United States are. They're both interfering in European politics in similar ways and for similar ends, insofar as Trump wants to best position US economic, financial, and industrial interests, the tech bros, kind of in a way that they can dominate in Europe, and wants to have European populist far-right political parties in his own mold as just, somehow subsidiaries of the US MAGA movement. And Putin is doing similar sorts of things, but obviously to completely weaken Europe and for Russia to be able to dominate and flex its muscle wherever it wants to, military muscle and, kind of political muscle. And I think, that what Trump is not seeing here is it's still a battle for Europe. But Europeans have to kind of rise up here and battle for themselves as the Ukrainians are. Because Putin and Trump are both interested in spheres of influence. And right now, I think what Trump isn't seeing is that Putin wants to call the shots in all of Europe, not just in Eastern Europe. He wants to have, that recognition that Churchill gave at Yalta of Eastern Europe being a no-go zone. But, frankly, that still includes all of the countries that were formerly in the Eastern Bloc that Putin would still like to have leverage over. And he already has it over Hungary and Slovakia. You can see that very clearly to some degree to Romania. And he's putting pressure on the Baltic states and Poland and also on Finland. We've just got to recognize what's happening here. And I don't think that the United States, or at least this isn't the United States, this is Trump and the people around him, fully appreciate that you give up on Europe. You're kind of basically taking the US out of a broader game. Maybe I think that's what they want to do. It's certainly what J.D. Vance wants to do, but it will be to the detriment of the United States, economically as well as politically. They're not isolationists in the sense that we think they are, but they want to play a totally different game. They want to dominate their own, the Western Hemisphere, be that Canada, Greenland, or, as we've seen, what's happening in Venezuela. And they're just kind of, are almost giving up the ghost of America past in Europe at this particular time.
But again, as you said, this is Trump and J.D. Vance and their mates. But what about the Republicans in Congress? What about the Democrats? I mean, do you think that he has shifted the debate fundamentally away from Europe? Or are there still Americans out there who are saying, no, this is a really bad idea, and ultimately we're going to have to get involved again to sort out the mess?
Well, there are, but the problem is that they've got a mess at home. So, America is in big trouble at the moment. I think that's obvious to everyone. And there's a battle for America as well going on. And it's not just about, ideological left or right Democrats versus Republican. It's about the whole idea of what America is. Who are Americans? Are people like me who are naturalized citizens Americans? Or, do we have to come off the Mayflower? J.D. Vance, who's, family obviously came at different points, to Appalachia from different parts of the United Kingdom and elsewhere, and who's married to someone, whose family are naturalized, is basically saying that, you have to have these multiple generations, going back in America to be an American. There's a redefinition of what America is going on right now. There is a battle for America. And that's kind of where the Democrats and Republicans who, might have different views on foreign policy are finding themselves caught up as well. I was just recently in Concord, Massachusetts, and there are signs all over Concord, ahead of the 250th anniversary of the American Revolution and independence, basically saying now it's time, it's our turn to fight tyranny. And it's got, as the image of the Minuteman from the statue from the bridge in Concord. And I was like, whoa, okay, I haven't seen those anywhere else, but it's put up by, the citizens of Concord, Mass, because this is kind of where we are. 250 years on, the soul of America is being fought for again. So I think, for the Europeans and the UK, you're going to have to get on with, getting your own house in order at this point.
Yeah, but that's easier said than done, isn't it? Because we've got similar battles going on in European countries. You've got the populist right, on the verge of power in France. They're already in power in Italy. They might get into power in Germany. And these are essentially, forget about whether they're right or left, whether they're populist or just popular. These are countries, these are people, parties, potentially governments that believe in nation states, which is kind of what Trump believes in as well, what Putin believes in. And then you're back to the 19th century across the board.
Exactly. Look, and I think, for people who would like to live in, kind of more 21st century states, and which we kind of recognize that the world is much more complex. It really is very important to stand up and speak out in these contexts. The whole definition of a nation state is being redrawn as well. There was lots of academic, thinking about that these are all imagined communities. I thought that about a lot during, my recent, trips back to Northeast England and looking at, kind of the flag of St. George everywhere. For example, what is England? That's what's up, for contention at the moment.
It's a very lively debate happening right now.
It is a very lively debate. When you have devolution to Scotland, you have, cultural autonomy and a bit more devolution to Wales and, Northern Ireland as well as, home rule. What is England in that kind of context? And every country, as you point out, is going through that, but so is Russia. And what Russia is trying to do is to define that on the battlefield in Ukraine and telling Ukrainians that they are also Russians. So that is also the battle for who gets the right to define a nation state. And Europe said, we're not doing that again. We're not going back to these 30 years, 60 years, 100 years wars, or that cycle from World War I to World War II, post-imperial fighting for a nation state. We've already made our minds up that we're going to move into somewhere else. So that's, basically what people are being challenged to do. And that's what's happening on Ukraine on those front lines, just as much as it's happening in America and everywhere else.
Yeah, if Europe could wear a T-shirt about wars, it would have been there, done that written on it. What's become obvious from this conversation is that this is about much more than just Ukraine, and we get lost in the weeds of a 28-point plan or a 19-point plan. But this really is a test case for what kind of Europe, what kind of world, under what kind of security umbrella we want to live in.
It is, absolutely. And it's a test that we've been failing, I would say, in large part for the last 100 years. because the very first time that Ukraine got independence was at the end of World War One. And then we cycled through World War Two, and we thought we had things at least just frozen in place for the Cold War. And then when we get out of the Cold War, we have that whole idea. We've talked so many times of the cliche of the end of history, but it wasn't. It was basically a reversion, to where we'd started before. This is another chance to get this right. And unfortunately, again, we look like, for all the reasons that you've laid out, that we're going to fail that test again. All that we can hope for, with the kinds of things that we've done in the past, is to just freeze things in place. And that's what this peace deal really is. It's about creating buffer zones. It's creating, the kind of standoff that is ultimately unstable that we had for that whole period of the Cold War, that we've had, in various previous points in the 19th and 18th centuries. So look, we've got a chance now to do things different. And the reason we've got the rise of populism is because people are unhappy. They're filled with grievance about, how politics has gone in their individual countries, that it's not delivering for them. But look, the message that we all should get, which the Ukrainians have absolutely got, is you've got to actually deal with things yourself. You might get some help from the top or from the outside, but ultimately it's up to you, to basically decide how things go. And I think that, again, what we're all going to have to do is dig deep at all kinds of different levels and realize that one guy, kind of one peace deal, one anything is not going to fix things. It's going to be a tough time ahead for all of us, but we're just going to have to face up to it. It's not like, again, as you said, been there, done that. We've definitely been there before.
And what or who can make Vladimir Putin realize that actually, ultimately this might not even be in his interest? I mean, that this will end in tears even for him.
Well, a lot of that is up to people inside of Russia as well. But it is up to all of us to show that he can't go any further. People have got to stop, taking bribes. People have got to stop just taking Russian propaganda and information, and American as well, on face value. Stop, these wars, internally with each other, and try to actually get kind of some sense of the moment that we're in, and a bit of patriotism about their own countries, and trying to dig in. And if Putin thinks that he actually can't manipulate everybody anymore, it's not just going to be about sanctions, but if he can't just win the fight for our minds, and he can't really go any further, and he's just making these incremental gains on the battlefield, maybe he can be induced to stop. But it's going to take a lot of effort by everyone, not just, one set of people, in Qatar or UAE or Geneva or wherever it is, or Miami, wherever they decided to meet at the moment. It's going to take a concerted effort by a lot more people to really, stop Putin in his tracks.
Trump famously called you the deep state. What was it? What did he use?
Deep state stiff with a nice accent.
The deep state stiff with a nice accent. You could argue with a couple of things in that statement.
I'm sure you could.
but I mean, I just wonder, as someone who, was born in this country, then you made your life and your career in the United States, you still work over here occasionally. I mean, do you feel completely rootless in this very fragmented and rather chaotic world?
No, I don't actually. And I think that's, obviously, I mean, you're not saying it because of that, but it's usually something that, people throw at people when they want to kind of basically say that you don't have a stake. I know exactly where I'm from. I'm from the northeast of England, which brings not baggage, but actually I think a very clear sense of, kind of what's what and where you are, and definitely been there, done that before. And I've been here in the United States since 1989. And, I've made a commitment, to stand up for, what I think is important here, because the United States was a beacon. It was a place that people could come to and to look to, for eventually, after, so much machination, coming out on the, at least attempting to come out the right side of history. And so many people here in civil society, actually in the US government, in all of its, varied forms, were actually really striving to improve things and to, work together with others. And Trump is just tossing all of that away. And, I think it's very important at this particular moment to say where your roots are and what you're trying to stand up for. And it's just...
You're not a citizen of nowhere, Fiona Hill. You're a citizen of somewhere.
I'm a citizen of two very definitive places. I'm a dual citizen. And, I think that both the UK and, the United States do have a shared history. So many people have their origins in the UK, not just the founding fathers, but Trump himself, J.D. Vance, many of these other... I mean, look at the last names of all of these people who are revolving around Trump. Perhaps not Witkoff, whose family probably came from Imperial Russia at some point.
Yeah.
But many of the other people have names of, of the British Isles writ large, be it Irish or Scots or English or Welsh, here. We're tied together, we're tethered, together in history, whether we are, quite so closely in the future.
Sure. And that famous Cumbrian Marco Rubio, of course.
Well, yes, there's that. But anyway,
right.
but look, I think he knows himself also, where he's from. And that's what you actually have to remember, that America is a complex place. Perhaps it's not the melting pot that it was before, but people bring all kinds of different perspectives as well as heritages to the United States. It's made it strong in the past, but this effort to get people to, buy into a whole different view of what America is, I think is going to diminish America as we look forward. That is not its strength. That is a great weakness.
We'll leave it there. Fiona Hill, thank you very much for your time and happy Thanksgiving.
Thanks so much, Matt.
Some really interesting insights there from Fiona Hill. And of course, before that, from Lindsay Hilsum, our international editor as well. Thanks very much for listening this week. We'd love to hear your comments, and we want you to subscribe as well, because that really helps us build up the TrumpWorld family to make that world even bigger than it already is. Anushka will be back in the chair next week. So from all of us here, thank you very much. That's it from TrumpWorld. Happy Thanksgiving.